right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Dr. Jonathan Cox, and I am the Vice President for the Center for Policy Analysis and Research at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. Now, it's really my pleasure to welcome you all to this Social Justice and Educational Access webinar of the end of race-conscious admissions in higher education. What does this mean for Black students? Now, our goal here for tonight is really simple, right? We really want to just create a space for reflection on the recent Supreme Court ruling declaring race-based admissions unconstitutional and explore the impacts of this decision, as well as where we all go from here. Now, before we get started, I want to take some time to introduce our esteemed panelists for this evening, who will be sharing their expertise and perspectives. First, we have Danielle Davis, Esquire. Now, Ms. Davis joined the National Education Association's Office of General Counsel as staff counsel in September 2021. Now, before joining the National Education Association, Danielle worked as a senior staff attorney at Southern Poverty Law Center, a staff attorney at Advancement Project, and a fellow and later an associate at Marion Scalé, PLLC. Now, she also served as a federal judicial law clerk in the U.S. District Court for the Middle District of Louisiana and the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Louisiana. Danielle is a 2009 graduate of Howard University of Law and a former Peggy Browning Fund Fellow. Danielle is licensed to practice law in Louisiana, Maryland, and the District of Columbia. So thank you, Danielle, for joining us.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
Next, we have Dr. Kimberly Griffin. Dr. Griffin is Dean of the College of Education and Professor of Higher Education, Student Affairs, and International Educational Policy at the University of Maryland. Now, her research generally focuses on efforts to promote access and diversity in higher education with a focus on the experiences of Black students and faculty. Now, much of her recent work centers on increasing racial diversity in graduate education and the professoriate, particularly in science. Thank you, Dr. Griffin.
Pleasure to see everybody.
Third, we have Lodriguez Murray. Now, Mr. Murray serves as the Senior Vice President for Public Policy and Government Affairs at UNCF, the United Negro College Fund, where he is the lead executive coming up with the strategies on how to secure funding, resources, and federal support for HBCUs and their students. Notably, he has been successful at impacting over $7 billion through various legislative avenues in less than 6 years. Now, Lodriguez is an example of what UNCF, HBCUs, and access to education can do. He's a first-generation college and high school graduate, an HBCU graduate from Morehouse College in Atlanta, and a UNCF scholarship recipient during his time at Morehouse. Thank you, Lodriguez, for being here.
Happy to be here.
And last but not least, of course, we have Dr. Ivory Toldson. Now, Dr. Toldson is the National Director of Education, Innovation, and Research for the NAACP, Professor of Counseling Psychology at Howard University, and Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Negro Education. Now, previously, Dr. Toldson was appointed by President Barack Obama to devise national strategies to sustain and expand federal support to HBCUs as the Executive Director of the White House Initiative on Historically Black Colleges and Universities. He also served as President and CEO of the QEM Network and contributing education editor for The Root, where he debunked some of the most pervasive myths about African Americans in his Show Me the Numbers column. Thank you, Dr. Toldson, for being here.
Thank you for the introduction. Great to be here.
Yeah, so I'm really thankful again to all of you for making the time to be here with us this evening. And so with that said, I want to start to get into this discussion. A quick note for the audience, for anybody attending, if you all have questions for our panelists, you can use the Q&A feature to submit those, and we will get to them as we have time. Now, as a quick recap, we all know that last week on June 29th, the Supreme Court struck down race-based admissions policies in higher education, declaring them to be unconstitutional. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here, probably not a very far limb, I think, to say that I imagine most of our panelists and probably many of you all attending as well really saw this coming, right? I don't know that it was much of a surprise. I also really would encourage people to read through the majority opinion that was provided by Chief Justice Roberts to get context on the decision, but also really dive into the dissents that were provided by Justice Sotomayor and Justice Jackson, which were really masterfully crafted responses that highlight some of the main issues to this. But let's go ahead and hear from our panelists. And so I want to start by opening it up to you all to provide just some initial thoughts and reactions to the SCOTUS ruling ending race-based admissions practices in higher education. So we'll go around the horn and after we hear from each of you, then we'll start to dive in a little bit deeper. Who would like to go first? I'll just offer it up.
I'll jump in.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think the fact that we're not surprised shows how little value we see in the Supreme Court right now, because we should be surprised that a fringe organization that has tried the same thing over and over with a cast of very weak cases of white people who were not denied admissions, who could not find a credible white plaintiff that had actually been denied any opportunity because of these programs, and had to come with a very lame argument that a group of Asian students, none of which we've seen, so we can't verify that they have been discriminated against, and they were able to take this anonymous group of students, fringe organization, and win against two of the most powerful universities in the United States. So for us to expect them to prevail means that we see this court, which, a third of them was appointed by Trump. One of them is a raging lunatic against affirmative action and seems to be very disconnected from what actually happens. So it does show that how far it's gone down. Just a quick initial thought though about the actual ruling. The majority opinion does not mention affirmative action, so that's a good thing. The majority opinion also is very rigid in looking at only race-based admissions and does not address anything else like scholarships, recruiting, or diversity programs. So that's a good thing. And the majority opinion also says that you could use race in this very limited circumstance of someone stating that on their application, talking about how it influenced their lives, and you can consider it if it has influenced in a way that you think will add value to your institution. So those are some things that we see as some wiggle room for institutions to really commit to the pledge of diversity no matter what. No matter this outcome, institutions can still commit to diversity.
Thank you. Who else wants to go ahead and jump in? Go ahead, Lodriguez.
Well, I like to look at it more as a panoramic view than a snapshot. So I don't just start at last week's decision. I go back to 2016 or 17 and borrow from my friend, Dr. Walter Kimbrough, with the Missouri effect. I look at it in the context of the pandemic. I look at it at the context of already applications being way up for historically Black colleges and universities because Black students are rediscovering them and they want an environment where they can be at home. During some of the most formative years of their life, they want an environment where they aren't just a number, where they know that they can grow and learn and be inspired by people that look like them and come from the same backgrounds. And so while there is disappointment in the decision, there's also opportunity. As we relearn about historically Black colleges and universities, as we relearn about some of our own history, as we learn to once again look at ourselves and see opportunity, because we realize just because a person or an institution may be African-American or Black, that doesn't mean they have to be inferior at all. And they can probably be the best place for us if we invest in us right now.
Danielle, you and I look like we're both about to speak. Would you like to go?
Please go ahead.
So I saw this ruling and this decision through two lenses. So one, as a researcher and a scholar who studies higher education, who studies access and diversity, who was so well trained by the scholars who did the foundational research that made the link between diversity and learning and critical thinking and growth and development and all these wonderful things. So in the first series of affirmative action cases that came before the court, I couldn't help but be so disappointed after reading all the amicus briefs and all of the supporting evidence that spoke to why this was such a compelling interest and the reasoning behind why institutions were considering race as a factor, one of many factors in making admissions decisions. The campus communities that it was allowing folks to create, not only to activate diversity and learning, but to provide, sources of support and belonging and connection for students of color. That reasoning, that research, that like what's basically taken as empirical fact was just thrown out the window and was really, really disappointing. As a leader, so as someone who, is on senior administration on a university campus, also disappointed, but in some ways inspired that I have not come across a campus yet, and particularly not my own, that hasn't said that this removes a tool, but the goal is the same, that we are still committed to promoting equity and justice, that we still want to have an inclusive, connected campus community, and that this removes a tool from our toolbox to reach those goals. But we're now very intent on better understanding the decision, reading and rereading the decision, so that we understand what it says we can't do, but more importantly, what can we do? And how can we be creative and innovative and think outside the box around tools that we might have used before we can't use anymore, but let's create some new tools.
And I'm, of course, not surprised to hear that, at the National Education Association, which is the largest labor union in the country, representing more than 3 million K-12 teachers, higher ed faculty, school administrators, retired teachers, students preparing to become teachers, right? We recognize the significance of this decision. It's for that reason that NEA submitted an amicus brief, in which we argued that the court should continue to permit consideration as race as just one factor in the many factors considered in the admission process. Of course, we're profoundly disappointed by this extremist conservative majority's opinion. And we're acutely aware, right, of how this decision is going to impact our members, and most importantly, the students that they serve. And I've been thinking about this in the context of what I would describe really as like a nationwide attack on public education and on public school educators who are working hard every day to ensure that all students, regardless of their color, right, have access to public education that's honest, that's inclusive, right? But we've seen this groundswell of law and policymakers who are doing the opposite, right? And they're working hard to prohibit honest curricula, right? Limit diversity inclusion, chill classroom instruction, stoke unlawful discrimination, and undermine the public's faith in public education and our nation's educators. And we really just see this case as exacerbating, those issues, exacerbating the educational inequities that students are already challenged with, but share the optimism, right, as far as what this means for Black students and the path forward.
Great. Thank you all for jumping in there with some of your initial thoughts and really helping to set up I think it's going to be a really great discussion about some of this. There's so much to talk about. So we'll just kind of continue on. So thinking about some of the things that were just said, particularly what Danielle was just talking about, right? This idea that, and then also Lodriguez kind of brought up, right? This idea that this decision doesn't exist within a vacuum, right? It exists within kind of a set of previous decisions, previous scenarios that have been happening around the country, particularly, right? These attacks that are happening across all university spectrums, right? Across all institutional spectrums, not even with higher ed, but also with, K-12 too. So when we think about this particular ruling, what then are some of the really key implications for it? What do we see as some of the immediate things that are going to be happening, particularly in light of all these other things that we see that are going on within educational spaces in terms of limiting and restricting the ability of schools to provide these diverse environments, to provide the best education that they can for all these students? What do we see as some of these things happen?
Well, I'll say that I think it's going to hurt the schools more than it's going to hurt Black people, to be quite honest. There are a lot of institutions of higher education in the United States, and all of them experience an enrollment incline while millennials were college age because they were the largest generation in history. And now we're seeing an enrollment cliff. And so there's a lot of institutions that have already started to try to increase their diversity efforts because they need a larger enrollment. There's a greater competition for students. And then we're also going to see a decline in international students coming to the United States because they're growing their own industries abroad. These institutions or these countries that saw the United States as being this exceptional nation that had the finest colleges and all the elite within their students here, that's starting to wane, and the statistics are showing that. So I think that if we continue to look at the institutions that want to accommodate us, look at the HBCUs and the other minority serving institutions and make sure we invest in them, and make sure that the predominantly white institutions that want us are making an earnest effort, earnest by doing things like diversifying their faculty, putting resources towards physical spaces for their students, making sure there's scholarship opportunities, not just for Black and Brown students, but also low income and first generation students. So all of that needs to happen. So the Supreme Court took a tool away from institutions, but they didn't take a tool away from Black people.
Interesting.
I think that's an interesting thought process. I have a slightly different one. You have to remember that there are millions of Black people involved in higher education, students today. And some of the most selective colleges and universities have very few African Americans already on their campus. That's for a number of reasons. I look more inward. I look more at our institutions, and I want to see a strengthening at those institutions because they want to welcome more Black students, more students, period. And so at UNCF, what we've done is begun to ask those on the Hill and in the administration to make some alterations to budget and appropriation numbers, even though they haven't come out with their appropriations numbers yet. But we've asked for alterations. We've talked to the Biden-Harris White House and said, you level funded several historically Black college and university programs in your fiscal year 24 budget. We're asking that you try to make some amends for that and some outreach to Capitol Hill and try to up those numbers in your requests, because we've already seen a rise in HBCU applications over a number of years. We believe that that'll continue and multiply many-fold over. If that does, what you're going to need to see is HBCUs being invested in by the federal government, by states, by philanthropists, by us, making sure that the dorms, there are enough dorms and they're the quality that students want. The research facilities are going to be what's needed so that we can do what we need to do to end health disparities, and that the institutions are able to take that special brand of magic and broaden it. And when I say special brand of magic, I mean you have institutions that have done so little, done so much with so little for so long. And now that you have an opportunity to have even more students, now is the time to make the investment so that they can do more with more. Imagine if HBCUs actually had the amount of resources necessary, how much better could the quality of education be? And so this is that time to figure it out. There's a silver lining in every cloud. And if you want to continue to look at those same institutions, which have bigger endowments, but have never been able to crack the code on what to do with students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, go right ahead. I'm focusing on the institutions that have actually been able to show how to take students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and make them successful, because even more of those same types of students are knocking on our doors. And instead of turning them away, I think it's time to find enough funding to let all of them in.
I appreciate your comments so much and really respect and hold up the work that's being done at HBCUs. It's second to none, and often done, like you said, like on a dime, right? Like so under-resourced. I think one of the things that historically white institutions really have to learn from HBCUs is what does it mean to really center a student and their learning and their development as your mission, right? That if we really and truly said like our mission is to center the most marginalized students on campus, knowing that when we center those who are most marginalized, everybody benefits, right? Like everybody benefits from the resources generated. Everyone benefits from the campus community that's created. That we all benefit from that. So I think that's certainly a lesson that historically white institutions can take from this moment. But I also think about the ruling and the inherent tension in the ruling between structural racism and individual racism. I think just even in Robert's decision, that's like, well, surely you can mention how race has an impact on your individual life that has prepared you with skills that would make you better equipped to succeed at a particular college. There's something nuanced like that, right? So acknowledging that, sure, someone can experience like race as an individual person, but that there are structural dynamics in place. There are policies and laws and rules that would have to change that fundamentally alter the disparities that we see in access to and experiences in education. And I think that campuses, I hope, will take that lesson really seriously, that we have to really think on the fronts of individual racism and structural racism when we engage in reform, that we have to change policies, we have to change processes, we have to change procedures, in addition to doing all the important, implicit bias training work we might do, or intergroup dialogue training that we might want to do. That work is important. And we have to really rethink how we think about who we recruit, how we retain students, how we recruit faculty, what conditions are necessary from a structural level to really promote everybody's success.
Yeah, this is interesting. I've been thinking about, how many students does this actually impact, right? Because we're talking actually about a pretty small set of colleges and universities, right? Not that they don't matter, right? Like what happens at those institutions does matter. And, as Justice Jackson pointed out in her dissenting opinion, right? Like we don't live in a colorblind society, and there is a huge gap. But I think, as it relates to NEA and our members, we're also just so focused on all the things that happen to Black students before there's even opportunity to apply to one of these elite institutions, right? How educational opportunities just remain grossly unequal along racial lines, right? And then the 70 years since the court issued its decision in Brown versus Board, right? K-12 schools remain segregated, they're inequitable, arguably they're getting worse, right? More segregated now than in the 1960s. So like, let's back it up a bit, right? Like what are we doing today to prepare students to even be in a position to attend a college or university, to be well-equipped for the academic rigor involved in that experience? Never mind, right? How all of the research shows us, right? That diverse student bodies, racially inclusive and culturally relevant curricula, right? It's the best pedagogical approach. Students benefit from that, students of all colors, right? So yes, that's great for them, but where do we, it seems like there's so much opportunity for investment and focus on the work, the desperate work that needs to be done to prepare Black students at the K-12 stage to even be prepared for that next step.
Right. I think this is really great points, right? I really like this idea that, again, Justice Jackson really pointed out in her dissent, and then Kimberly, you just brought it up, and Danielle kind of piggybacked on that as well, this idea of colorblindness, right? And so what we're seeing is, further entrenchment of this supposed post-racial society that we live in, where race does not matter for the outcomes of individuals, right? It may matter in terms of your individual experiences, right? So sure, somebody can discriminate against you, but it doesn't matter in terms of those full outcomes. There's no systemic or structural problem that we're seeing. And so again, that just further entrenches this idea of colorblindness. And that's what actually really prevents real change, right? We can see that the actual inequalities that we see existing, particularly for Black Americans in this country, they're not going to go away if we aren't able to directly address the impacts of racism that's built into the structures and systems that exist, right? And so we're seeing this in this very acute example of higher education that then has significant impacts on other things that are happening in people's lives, right? Their ability to earn a significant wage, right? A living wage or beyond, right? And so that's another thing we could think about in terms of connection to this ruling that does speak a lot more, at least initially, to the more elite institutions, right? The very highly selective institutions. But we know that those institutions do generally they lead to more, again, more social and cultural capital that people are building, to higher earnings and wages. And so again, we know there are tons of these other institutions that exist, right? That can and do provide those things for students, but we know that that often comes in very insulated ways through some of these elite institutions. So it's really interesting then to hear you all talk about some of the ways that we can think beyond these institutions and really maybe bolster up attendance at HBCUs or other institutions that maybe are doing this work that we don't even talk about on a regular basis. So I think that's really great. And so one of the things that I wanted to ask about is again, as we're thinking about some of these implications that exist for different students, right? We've obviously talked about some of the outcomes that exist, particularly for Black students and other people of color. We know this is not really going to impact white students overall, right, at all. What then are some thoughts or things that we could think about in terms of that preparation that needs to happen for students who are going to be entering college? I'm thinking about like the parent of a high school student or about soon to be college age student, or college applicants that are going to be applying, next year, right, and beyond. What are things we could think about for them, or what structures and things that we need to change that will be able to better foster their ability to go ahead and get this education that they're seeking so much, that could hopefully lead to some change in their lives?
Yeah, and I wouldn't say that this won't affect white students. It's affected white students in California, where they're underrepresented at all of the most selective state institutions. Berkeley only has 19%, it's only 19% white, is majority Asian, even though the state of California isn't majority Asian. So, if white people want to play that game, then, because if we're only looking at test scores and GPAs, then white people will be affected. And the white enrollment at Harvard is being propped up by legacy admissions, big donors, faculty members' children, and athletics. 45% of all the white students at Harvard fit into those categories. So if we're going to really go all in on meritocracy, then they will not keep up either. But we all want a more holistic way of evaluating an applicant. And we understand that test scores alone really is a poor predictor. And the research has shown that's a poor predictor of how well a student will do. So one of the things that we need to do is to make sure that every university actually has a fair process. Having race-conscious admissions help to reduce some of the implicit biases and explicit biases. But it was really a Band-Aid on a broader problem of institutions like the College Board having so much control over how we look at what is a qualified student and who's not a qualified student. I think Danielle also had a lot of very important things to contribute to this that I won't repeat. But overall, the things that she said about making sure that we shore up and fortify the K-12 system to look at all of these institutions, or all of these students who are going to a variety of different institutions. And then also, with HBCUs, HBCUs are very important, but we do have to stress that 90% of all Black students are not going to HBCUs. And you have these very popular HBCUs like Howard, who only accept a third of the students who apply. So Howard getting more applicants will not help us. So the HBCUs that are not as well known, whose enrollment did not go up during this last spike in enrollment because of 2020, the 2020 cases, we need to make sure that all of the students know the full range of HBCUs, not just the ones that's popular. A lot of the ones that UNCF have been supporting and have been putting them on the map, showing characteristics of these institutions that really fly under the radar. So those are some of the things that I think we need to do.
If I were to talk to a family or to parents or to someone who is, about to be a senior this year, I think the first thing I would say is, don't be discouraged, apply anyway. Apply widely, because know that institutions are trying to do their work. They're trying to do their work, and that your job actually is to use your skills of discernment to better determine what institutions really are expressing a deep commitment to equity and justice on their campus, that really are invested in creating not only a diverse campus community, but one where you will go and you'll be supported. Folks are really going to be invested in you and your success there, that is your work, that institutions need to do their work to figure out what reforms we need to undergo in terms of our outreach, in terms of our admissions policies and practices. If we're really invested in having a diverse campus community, we have.
Oh, I think we lost Kimberly for a second. I'm sure she'll be right back, but if Danielle or Lodriguez, you want to jump in while we wait for Kimberly to get back?
Yeah, I just to piggyback on what she was saying, I think part of the point of this as well is sort of like to chill, right? Like, or discourage Black students from applying in the first place, right? Maybe they have a full understanding of the ruling, maybe they don't, but like the message that they're generally receiving, right, is that you're not welcome and you shouldn't even bother. And just going back to this, I can't help but think about sort of this thread that binds these concerted attacks, right? How they're using a similar strategy as it relates to the laws that are being passed in various states, right? Bills that are being introduced, right? We're just essentially trying to chill, right? Classroom discussion, right? Scare and intimidate educators, right? And really prevent them from adequately preparing students to apply to and be successful at institution of higher learning. And what does it look like for us to look at this, not as individual things that are happening, but more so as a national campaign, really led by these extreme conservatives, right, who are attempting to stir up backlash, right, against all these diversity inclusion measures, right, racially inclusive education and the like, right, that were enacted in K through 12 school districts, at public universities following the murder of George Floyd in 2020, right? And rather than exposing, right, all of the root causes of racial inequity and equipping students, right, to face these systemic issues, right, and be prepared for the rigors of college, right, these laws are looking to whitewash, right, history, right, intimidate educators, chill classroom discussion, prevent students from really having the critical thinking skills that they'll need, right, to be contributing members and participants in our democracy. And, for me, that thread that binds it is just so obvious. And, I think it's important for us to continue to think of it that way and look for opportunities to push back against what's happening, because it's really undemocratic, right? It's like seeking to impose these restrictions, to chill the speech of educators, to ban books, right? Based on the preferences of literally a couple of handfuls of people. The majority of us understand the importance of diversity inclusion. We understand the importance of diverse student bodies, right? Of racially inclusive curricula. So what are we going to do to preserve it?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Kimberly, I know you were away for a minute. You're back. Do you want to go ahead and finish your point?
I'm back. I don't know where I got cut off. I think I was just saying, students do not be discouraged. Apply everywhere. Not applying means no. So apply everywhere. No institutions are doing their work, and be very intentional on assessing whether or not all the words around commitment to diversity, inclusion, and justice are meant words. What resources are going to be available to you once you're on that campus, and who's going to be there to support you. But don't be discouraged.
Can I just add, I think it would be remiss if we didn't also acknowledge the court's decision in Biden versus Nebraska related to the student debt relief plan, right? As we're talking about how do we prepare young people, what are we doing to help young people? Hello, the cost, right, of college, and what does it mean for the millions of people, right, who have student debt because attending college is completely unaffordable for most people, right? And a disproportionate number of those people who have this student debt are Black women. Okay, so, I think the court's decision in both cases really reflects a failure to recognize the realities, right, that are faced by everyday people, certainly by Black Americans. And there's important work to be done as it relates to the cost of attending college or university, right? And what do we do to prepare young Black students for that and help them avoid, right, this terrible situation that many of us have found ourselves in.
I will say that none of this is intuitive, right? Like applying to college is not intuitive. Applying for financial aid is not intuitive. Figuring out which institutions will cover what at what level. I know the University of Maryland introduced a new policy where if you are Pell eligible, like there will be no loans for you. Like we'll figure it out. But a lot of students may not know that. So really just figuring out how institutions can do more to reach out to students to help them navigate all of those structures and systems. K through 12 education, how can we make sure that we're putting more folks in place that support students as they navigate this journey and support their families, so that, if we know that Black women have the heaviest debt burden, it's not only like, will they return to education, or will Black women in the future be indebted? Those Black women have children, so they can't support their children in navigating higher education in the same way. So we really have to be intentional about how we're sharing information and making the structures and systems that are in place much easier to navigate. The FAFSA is a mess and really, really difficult for a lot of folks to make sense of. So we don't want that to be the barrier and the decision about whether or not you can attend any institution, but particularly some of these really expensive, most selective ones.
I think what Danielle and Kimberly are talking about, a few issues that need to be brought together. So first, Danielle's talked about how K through 12 needs to be strengthened and the impact that it has, and the impact especially among those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, African Americans, et cetera. Kimberly talked about what applying and what you have to do to be ready if you're a senior. I think that we need to look at strengthening programs that prepare first generation college students. I grew up with absolutely no one in the family that knew anything about college. I didn't have anyone in my family that graduated high school. And so there was never a predisposition that I was going to go to college. It was, the most delightful surprise to my parents that I wanted to go to college. And so what you need to do is strengthen programs like the TRIO programs, you need to strengthen the Gear Up programs. And so that when students show an aptitude, you have support around them, even if they don't have that support in the family, and so that they can be shouldered up. In addition to that, we have to make sure that students have access to more scholarships. I think that if you know that you have enough money bundled together to go to college, making the decision on where you want to go is a whole lot easier. And so it's not just applying to college and there's a period after that sentence. It's a comma or a semicolon at worst, where you want to let people know that they need to find the money to follow them wherever they want to go. And so don't wait on the institution to try to bundle the money together for you. Bundle the money for yourself. Write your own ticket to where you want to go to college because you have enough money to pay for it. When I was going to college, you had to check out a book from the public library and write on the typewriter to fill out the applications. All of that is gone. And on a person's cell phone, on their iPad, on their laptop, on their MacBook, they can apply for a whole host of money. And so as the technology has brought the money closer to the students, what I've seen is fewer students reaching out for the money. And so we have to continue to encourage our students to go get the money. So it's not just the college education that helps you accrue debt. It's the college education that you can pay for because there's plenty of money out there. And it's not just UNCF. We're a great resource. We're the #1 private provider of scholarships to minorities in the country, period. The second largest private provider of scholarships in the country, period. But there's a lot of money out there and it is so easy. It's all a Google search away. And we have fewer and fewer students actually applying themselves to apply for the monies. That's what I would focus on if I had a senior sitting in front of me. How much money are you getting for wherever you want to go?
Absolutely. I mean, these are all really great points, right? I really like where this discussion has gone, right? Kind of taking us through the ins and outs of what some of the implications are for this decision. Kind of going back to one of the things that Danielle brought up, right? I was really interested in is this idea of kind of beyond some of the things that we've talked about with regards to what's some of the fallout for these decisions is what other things maybe are in danger or what other things could be touched as a result of this decision coming down, right? And I know that another colleague, Dr. Sean Harper at the University of Southern California, wrote a piece recently in Forbes, right, talking about this idea of kind of interpretive overreach, right? This is something that we've seen in many, many states where there are legislatures that are putting into place restrictive bills against what can be taught and what different things can be done. And so people are just either misinterpreting or overinterpreting what the laws actually apply to. And so we may see something like that happen with this. And so I'm interested in you all's thoughts about what maybe some of the implications are kind of beyond this particular piece of legislation, even what we just tied in with the legislation against the student loan forgiveness. Are there other things that may be in danger as a result of this decision that could have further impacts on students?
Yeah, well, I think a biggest natural tendency is to take whatever tool they could find and use it to their advantage. And I think that a lot of people will exploit, and a lot of institutions will exploit people's lack of understanding about what this has done. And the media reports that says that this has ended affirmative action, that's certainly not helping. So we have to make sure that all of us, and you have over 500 people participating here, so I hope all the participants know that this does not affect affirmative action programs generally, and that is a very narrow decision that focuses on non-military institutions of higher education. And it was very curious that they allowed affirmative action programs to remain intact for military institutions. But one of the real dangers, I think, is that this court has signaled that it's willing to take on some pretty absurd cases in order to fulfill a certain agenda. And so some people who may have said, this case is too crazy to make it up to the Supreme Court, so I won't waste my time with it. They're going to say, well, we have the court that we want now. This court will take a web design company that does not exist, that says, when nobody from the LGBTQ community was checking for her website anyway and would not have hired her, I'm sure, because there's plenty of talent within their community, or at least allies. But she got a case all the way to Supreme Court. I already talked about the absurdity of the one that was used in this case. So I think there's going to be a lot of lawsuits like that that's trying to climb up, and advocacy organizations like the ones represented here, UNCF, CBCF, NAACP, and NEA, and some of our fine institutions of higher education like University of Maryland. We really need to try to suppress a lot of this from Jump Street. to work with our legal teams, and we need to start advancing some lawsuits ourselves. We don't have to get it all the way up to the Supreme Court, but we do have to find our own plaintiffs that's being harmed by these decisions and other types of decisions. We need to, the best defense is offense.
There's a weaponization of the courts, but in addition to that, you see some very overzealous state legislatures. And so there's a need for us to pay attention there. There's a trend where we often pay attention to very national, big headline things that you can find as you scroll through Instagram. However, where our attention also needs to be is at the state and the local level to make sure those leaders are not doing the things that we don't want. And so I'm going to encourage folks to stay really active with their local and with their states representatives and make sure that they're advancing causes that matter to them and not blindly allowing some of these same provisions to be codified at the state level and become way broader than, as Ivory said, that was intended by the decision. People just speak about affirmative action and they kind of leave it open-ended. And so people think that this is way broader than it is. It's a higher education decision. And I am floored that the military institutions were not included in this. And so for me, I'm really interested at why race is still important at the military institutions as a tool for evaluating students when it's not everywhere else. To me, the society that governs and makes up the individuals that are going to military institutions is the same society that governs and makes up those of us in the rest of higher education. And so I'm really floored by that carve out. I'm really intrigued. I really wish I could be a fly on the wall when those 6 majority justices were deciding to do that carve out. I really want to know, and I think that might be a way, an avenue, as Ivory is saying, for some advocacy in the courts. That may be another way to get back in there and take another look here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, jumping in really quick, I think that the idea of the military still being able to use this, I think is, as you all are saying, are really intriguing. Right, and another colleague, Dr. Rayshawn Ray, who's at the University of Maryland with Kimberly, right? He tweeted something out kind of to the effect of, right, like, well, who are they preparing for war that they aren't preparing for the boardroom, right? Like we start to think about this idea that the military can use these tools to keep the diversity numbers up, right? To provide access, but institutions of higher education that are preparing people for other aspects of their lives, they can't, right? So that's really interesting. Either Danielle or Kimberly, other thoughts that you might want to add?
I think the only thing I would say is 2 things. That higher ed education is risk averse by nature, right? So that, we may see this ruling as like, well, we can't. And I always encourage folks, like, so what can we do though? Like, where does it leave room? Very similar to what my colleagues already said. This decision, my biggest concern going into the season was how far are they going to go? How much rope are they going to take? And it's actually relatively narrow that I was concerned about. In California, they can't consider it in financial aid and hiring. Like, it's a very broad statement about, I think, identity more generally, not even race. So the decision did stay relatively narrow. So I think the approach should be like, what does the decision explicitly say we can and cannot do? And how do we think very creatively about what we can do? And maybe take a few risks. I think the second piece is that I always remind myself how many times folks lost. Like, this was a very long game and a very long strategy. There was Grutter and Gratz. There was the Fisher case, Fisher 1 and Fisher 2. Like, this has been, there were a lot of losses before the win. So what is our long-term strategy? How many cases are we willing to put up and maybe lose a few times, but keep showing up and keep showing up and keep showing up? Because hopefully, should things, hopefully winds change, this is not necessarily the court forever. It's going to feel that way, but it's not necessarily the court forever. So what is our willingness to invest in a long-term strategy? Because, that's what the right did. It was a very long-term intentional strategy and just waiting and waiting and waiting until the right moment. So, in addition to wanting to make those incremental wins, we have to be willing to invest the time.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I would add to that, right? The strategy wasn't just a legal strategy or a federal court strategy, right? These campaigns, these multi-decade campaigns have also involved state legislatures. They've involved a narrative shifting campaign, right? Organizing in their case, right? Seemingly disjointed groups around one issue that now they're all crazy passionate about, right? This kind of made up issue or pending disaster. As a labor union, we recognize, right, like the importance of the Supreme Court and the decisions that they issue, but we understand that the real power is our people power, right? It doesn't come from this judicial body, right? That really, if Congress had the intestinal fortitude, could completely change, right? But the real power, I think, lies in everyday people, right? And our willingness to engage with these issues, engage with our elected officials, get rid of them, right? If they're not acting in the best interest of their constituents, right? But I think to refocus our efforts and our energy on building the sort of society I think that has been envisioned for so long, and we've seen bits and pieces of it, right? We get a little glimpse and it seemingly it goes away, right? But it's about like organizing. It's about holding elected officials accountable. It's about really engaging community members who get it, right? Like impacted people understand these issues better than any civil rights attorney could, right? How do we facilitate the conditions to allow everyday people, right, to get involved and for their people power to be the real power, not that of the Supreme Court?
Danielle, I like what you said there. And I look at it in a way that we need to find reasons to vote. There are lots of people who are single issue voters. Some are single issue voters around guns. Some are single issue voters around a whole host of other issues. We as a people, we as a group, we need to find more reasons to vote, because that adage that my vote doesn't matter anyway is still a little bit too pervasive for me. And so if we figure out that these education issues, these student debt issues, if there are reasons to vote, then they also should be reasons to stay engaged with your elected officials. It's the squeaky wheel that gets the oil. I may be the only one on here. I'm actually a registered lobbyist. I know what members of Congress talk about, and they actually are responsive to what people want them to do, but they need to feel the groundswell. And so tweeting isn't really going to do it. Liking an Instagram post isn't going to do it. You're going to have to pick up the phone and call them and tell them how you feel. If you're ticked off about these decisions, affirmative action and student debt, you need to pick up the phone and tell them. If you figure out they're on the education committee, you need to pick up the phone and tell them that you want them to do something about it. And write a letter, because no one can get rid of a written letter. It's the way Washington works. And so, but we need to continue to push and prod and figure out reasons to vote, figure out reasons to be loud, and figure out reasons to have elected officials hear us, feel us, and respond to us.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And I think that's a really great segue, because we're coming up on time. I wanted to ask each of you, right, as we're closing this discussion out, I think it's really important for us to really end on a call to action, rather, for all of our attendees, right? And so I really like what Lodriguez was just saying and Danielle was saying. And so open it up again, right, to everybody. And if you want to make additional comments, please feel free. But what can people do, right? What can those who are watching this do? What actions can they take, right? How do we best equip our communities to leverage these resources that you all have been talking about in ways that then can more effectively fight against what we're seeing happening with this court decision and other things?
Yeah, well, there's certainly organizations represented here that you can support. The NAACP, we have our Diversity No Matter What initiative. That's a sign on. We are also calling on institutions to commit to various action steps. They could sign our commitment or they can craft their own, but we will be evaluating over 1,600 institutions that have selective enrollment to see how they're doing on these things that are legal to do that advances diversity. But I think everyone understand their sphere of influence better than anyone else. And so I think that there's been some lessons learned and some very important things. I think one thing that we all absolutely have to do is to continue to vote and do the things that Lodriguez said that we should do. We all have to remain very vigilant and politically active, but support the children that's around us. There's just been a lot of very important things that's been said related to helping us to just wrap our arms around some of these young people who's just trying to figure this out. They may be very far from Harvard University, but closer to some other regional state institutions, minority serving institutions, even community colleges are very good state institutions. But a lot of young people just really don't know how to navigate this very complex space. So I think all of us, whether it's in our churches or our communities or in schools that we graduated from, have the opportunity to help some of these young people out.
And I have two quick messages.
Go for it.
One, research tells us, personal experience tells us the importance of Black teachers. Support our teachers, become a teacher, like really think about a career in education. As the Dean of a College of Education that desperately wants to increase the diversity of our teacher workforce and knows the transformative power of having a Black educator on the aspirations, the goals, the dreams of Black students, of all students, consider education as a pathway. And then the second, to my higher ed leaders and members of the higher ed community on the call today, just really encourage you to think collaboratively. I think we often think about like, how do we increase our numbers on our campus? But this is going to require a joint effort across all of our institutions. It's not institution versus institution. It's not historically white institutions versus predominantly Black institutions. It's how do we work together to ensure that we maintain and promote access and equity for all students, but particularly Black and Brown students in light of this decision. So how to really think creatively about how we collaborate.
Absolutely. And I would encourage folks to support labor unions, support the NEA, support K through 12 and higher ed educators, right, who continue to call on institutions of higher learning, as well as K through 12 school districts, right, to provide the sort of resources and funding, right, and academic freedom that's necessary to be sure that all students have access to equal educational opportunities. Push back against these state legislators and these school board members and these Moms for Liberty extremists, right, who are attempting to really fundamentally change what is happening in our K through 12 public schools to prevent students from learning accurate history, from understanding how the government works, right, to having the ability to engage in critical thinking. There's real work to be done, and you don't have to be a lawyer or a lobbyist or a professor to do it. There's important work for everyday people to be doing, and it's really going to take all of us.
Yeah, just to close out, Jonathan, I want people to donate to UNCF, United Negro College Fund. I want people to donate to little known institutions. You know, for every Morehouse, Spelman, or Howard, there's Talladega, there's Tougaloo, there's Texas College. And they do just as much to diversify the workforce and to make sure their regions and the country are more or richer as the institutions whose names you know. But I'd also be remiss if I didn't just underline that thought that the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And so if you want the things that really put a bee in your bonnet, if you want those things to get attention, you have to let policy and decision makers know. You elect decision makers, they make decisions for you. They're supposed to represent you, but they can only represent you if you tell them how you feel. And so you've got to pick up that phone and ring those offices, or you've got to write letters and emails and let them know. But it really matters. And so there's the thought process that the game only gets changed for Black people once we actually learn the game and are able to play it as well as anyone else. Well, the DC game hasn't changed since it began. And so that's because we haven't learned the game and moved and pushed and prodded to get our ideas taken care of. So we've got to push members of Congress, House and Senate, and we have to push the administration, let them know how you feel, they'll respond.
Great. Thank you all so very much. I really appreciate the insightful and timely discussion about this topic. I know I learned a lot from you all, had a great time engaging. I hope all of our participants feel the same. And so as we're closing out for this evening, I do want to offer thanks again to everybody who turned out today to join in our webinar. We really appreciate your engagement. And then also to you all, my esteemed colleagues, the panelists, please accept my heartfelt thanks on behalf of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation for taking the time out of your busy schedules to share your thoughtful perspectives and insights. Again, I just had an incredible time engaging with you all, and I really look forward to any future connections that we may have. Now, before everybody returns to their evening, I have two quick requests that I'd like to make of you. They're both very simple, but also really impactful. Number one, we would really like your feedback. So please scan the QR code to complete a survey about today's event. That's going to be showing up shortly. Your insights and input really do help us meet your needs for future events, and we want to make sure that we hear from you. Number two, make sure that you stay in the know about what's going on at CBCF by following us on Twitter, Instagram, connecting with us on LinkedIn, and liking us on Facebook. And for everybody also, please save the date for CBCF's annual legislative conference this year that's coming up. That will be happening this September from September 20th to 24th in Washington, D.C. That will be in person as well as hybrid online. And so the issues that we discussed today, as well as other issues that are critical to the Black community and that are currently at the forefront of national news, these will be the focal points of the conference sessions and brain trust. And so I really encourage everybody to join CBCF for these events. Thank you all once again for your time and attention. And on behalf of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, I wish you all a very pleasant and great evening. Peace.